My name is Lea Ypi. I'm a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to my exp. I think what is important about political parties in theory and as moral vehicles, as if we think about it in a critical way, is representation, is the idea that they take the concerns of a political community seriously, and that political community, through organization in political parties, is able to then seek representation in parliament and to then seek input in the making of particular laws, in the shaping of public policies. So what is really important about parties in principle, in the ideal, is that through parties, we become the authors of the laws to which we are subjected. We choose our representatives, and those representatives are delegated by us to try and represent our views, our principles, our commitments. So I think of parties as communities of principle and of the role that parties have in political life as one of representing the principles of collectives, of individuals when they come together and they form collectives, so that their demands on public life in the public sphere can become better articulated and can be heard better because they are the demands of a collective and not of isolated individuals. So I think, in theory, the role that parties have and the role that they should be promoting is that of trying to mobilize citizens to take seriously their political commitments, to enable them to channel these political commitments better, to formulate demands that then turn into laws and into public policies, and on the basis of those programs, on the basis of these principles, run for elections and seek access to political power. What happens in reality in many liberal societies is the opposite. What happens is that parties are motivated by the desire to win elections, no matter what. And so what happens is that then they stop trying to challenge the public, they stop becoming critical vehicles, they only take for granted the opinions and the views of citizens as they are, and then try and take these opinions as they are and formulate programs or platforms that then respond to these views. The problem with that way of looking at things is that sometimes these views are crude, they're not articulated enough, they are often the victim of media propaganda, they're often the victim of particular ways of particular ideologically perverted ways of looking at reality. And so the risk is that when parties take those views for granted as they are, they fail to play their critical role in channeling more principled ways of looking at the world. So I think what is really important when we think about parties is to stop thinking about parties as election-winning machines, and also stop putting the emphasis just on the leaders and on the MPs and on the set of policies that parties have, and to rather think about parties as vehicles of empowerment of ordinary citizens, and to also think of them as places where activism can happen, where one can be open, where one can receive the demands of social movements and channel them more productively. So I think if we try and think about how can we turn parties into a vehicle of empowerment rather than one of disenfranchisement, or one that consolidates the status quo and that reproduces the injustices that shape the status quo, I think the most productive way of thinking about that relationship is to think about parties as in continuity with social movements, and to think about parties as articulating the demands of social movements, and to articulating the demands in a way that is not bound up with the limitations of a particular electoral cycle, but also not with the limitations of a particular national sphere, national arena. In one way, they are similar. They are both vehicles of active citizenship. They're vehicles of political mobilization, in particular when we think about the role that progressive social movements and progressive political parties have played historically. Often they have been aligned, and often one has been the result of the other. what the challenge is for current social movements has been precisely to enable the instances that they have received, to enable these instances of protest that they have witnessed and that in some ways they have shaped in contemporary liberal democracies, to make them survive the particular cycle of protest in which they have manifested themselves. So one of the greatest challenges of social movements is that social movements don't seek institutional representation, and therefore they remain limited to the moment of political opinion formation or to the moment of protest and struggle against institutions, but without necessarily trying to shape and change institutions. And what parties can offer is the opposite. What parties do is they mediate between these instances of activism in what we might call civil society protest movements on the one hand, and lawmaking, government, public policy on the other. So parties are the intermediary between the sphere of lawmaking, decision-making, and the sphere of activism in civil society. I think the most productive way of seeing the relationship is one where we see a party that is not limited to just performing that, but that is a party that incorporates the demands of social movements and tries to channel institutions in light of these demands, often in the most progressive moments, in particular Western liberal political parties. Think about Democratic Party in the US recently, or the Labour Party a couple of years ago. What was particularly inspiring about the way in which those parties operated in these brief moments was the fact that they were open to activism. They were open to receiving instances of protest from civil society, and they were also open to empowering their members in driving that change.